The room exploded with laughter before Daniel Mercer could even finish his sentence. Hundreds of mathematicians, professors, researchers, and elite students filled the grand auditorium at Blackstone University. Crystal lights hung from the ceiling. Cameras recorded every second of the international symposium. On stage stood Professor Evelyn Cross, one of the most respected mathematical minds in the world, and near the back wall, holding a mop beside a yellow cleaning bucket, stood a 38-year-old janitor everyone assumed had made a mistake by opening his mouth. "I'm sorry," Daniel said quietly, his rough voice almost swallowed by the noise. "But the proof skips a contradiction in the fourth transition." More laughter. Someone muttered, "The janitor's reviewing topology now." Another voice added, "Maybe he cleans equations too." Daniel lowered his eyes. He was already regretting speaking. Professor Evelyn Cross crossed her arms and stared at him with visible irritation. She wore a dark gray blazer, sharp enough to match the cold confidence in her face. "And you are?" she asked. "Daniel Mercer. And your field of expertise, Mr. Mercer?" The audience waited. Daniel hesitated. "I work here." That made the laughter worse. Evelyn gave a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Right. Well, Mr. Mercer, advanced mathematical structures can appear confusing if you don't have formal training." The crowd nodded along. Daniel gripped the mop handle harder. He should have stayed quiet. That's what life had taught him years ago. Stay quiet, keep your head down, do the work, go home. That rule had kept food on the table for him and his daughter after his wife died 3 years earlier. It kept people from asking questions. It kept his painful past buried. But tonight, standing in that auditorium, while scholars mocked him like he was invisible trash in work boots, something inside him felt tired. Not angry, just tired. Professor Cross turned back toward the massive digital board behind her. "As I was saying," she continued, "the Klein-Vasquez convergence problem remains unsolved because the recursive chain collapses at boundary 7, Daniel said before he could stop himself. Silence. A few people blinked. Evelyn slowly turned around again. This time her expression changed slightly. "What did you say?" Daniel swallowed hard. He could already feel every eye drilling into him. His pulse hammered in his neck. "I said the recursive chain collapses," he repeated carefully, "at the 7th boundary condition. The symmetry assumption only works if the sequence remains positively constrained. But yours doesn't." Now the room wasn't laughing. They were confused. A professor in the front row frowned and whispered to another attendee. Evelyn stared at Daniel for several long seconds. Then she gave a dry chuckle. "That's an impressive sentence," she said. "Did you memorize it from YouTube?" Scattered laughter returned. Daniel felt heat crawl into his face. He should walk away, he knew that. But then he remembered his daughter Lily sitting at home doing homework at the kitchen table earlier that morning. "You always quit when people look down on you," she had told him once during an argument. The words hit him now harder than the laughter. Evelyn picked up a piece of chalk and wrote a long sequence across the board. "All right," she said, amused. "Let's have some fun. Since you seem interested, why don't you explain where the contradiction is?" The audience leaned forward, expecting entertainment. Expecting humiliation. Daniel stared at the board. His breathing slowed, and for the first time that night, his eyes stopped looking uncertain. They looked focused, different, almost dangerous. "Because," he said quietly, stepping toward the stage, "your proof assumes linear preservation where the function is actually folding inward." The room went completely still. And somewhere in the audience, one old professor suddenly sat upright in shock. "Impossible," he whispered. Daniel could feel every heartbeat in the room as he stepped onto the stage. His work boots left faint wet marks across the polished floor. The mop water on his sleeve suddenly felt embarrassing under the bright lights, but he ignored it. The auditorium was dead silent now. Professor Evelyn Cross moved aside slowly, though the annoyance on her face remained. Go ahead then, she said. Show us. Daniel stared at the massive chalkboard. For a moment, his hand stayed still. Then he picked up the chalk. The first line he wrote looked ordinary enough. A few symbols, a rewritten transition, but within seconds, whispers started spreading through the audience. People stopped smirking. Several professors leaned forward. Daniel didn't rush. He wrote calmly, carefully, like someone who had lived with a theorem in his head for years. Your recursion works until this point, he explained quietly, but the symmetry breaks because the convergence isn't stable under inversion. Evelyn folded her arms tighter. That's already been tested, Daniel nodded. Incorrectly. A few people actually laughed nervously at that, but Daniel kept writing. Step after step, he rebuilt the theorem from a completely different angle. The room's energy changed with every equation added to the board. At first, people looked amused, then curious. Now they looked uncomfortable. Because the janitor wasn't guessing, he understood everything. More than that, he was exposing flaws nobody else had noticed. An older mathematician suddenly stood from the front row. No, he muttered under his breath. No, no, no. Daniel circled part of the proof. Right here, he said. This assumption creates a hidden collapse condition. That's why nobody can solve the final sequence. You're all building on a broken midpoint. The professor who had stood up slowly removed his glasses. My God! Evelyn's jaw tightened. You're claiming 20 years of published work is wrong? Daniel finally looked at her directly. No, he answered softly. I'm saying it was incomplete. That hit harder. The audience sat frozen. Daniel erased part of the board and continued solving forward from the corrected structure. The equations became more advanced, more abstract, almost impossible to follow unless someone had spent decades studying high-level mathematics. Yet Daniel moved through them naturally, like breathing, like memory. A young student in the crowd whispered, "Who is this guy?" Nobody answered, because suddenly everyone wanted the same thing, an explanation. Daniel finished the final sequence and stepped back. Silence swallowed the auditorium. The impossible theorem sitting on the board for years was solved, not fully, but enough to open the door nobody else could reach. Evelyn stared at the equations without blinking. Her confidence was cracking now. You couldn't have done this alone, she said quietly. Daniel's expression shifted for the first time. Pain flickered across his face. Very brief, very deep. Then he placed the chalk down carefully. I didn't, he said, and somehow those two words carried the weight of a broken life. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever loved someone with a truly pure heart, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you never miss these emotional stories that stay with you long after they end. Nobody moved after Daniel stepped away from the board. The entire auditorium looked trapped between disbelief and embarrassment. A few people quietly checked their phones, searching his name, hoping there was some famous mathematician they had somehow failed to recognize. But there was nothing. No published papers, no university profile, no awards, just a maintenance employee listed in Blackstone University's payroll system. Professor Evelyn Cross stared at the equations like they had personally betrayed her. You said you didn't do it alone, she finally said. Daniel looked uncomfortable now that the attention had shifted fully onto him. He glanced toward the exit like he wanted to leave before things got worse. But it was too late for that. An older professor near the front slowly stood up, Professor Harold Weiss, one of the oldest living mathematicians in the country. His voice shook slightly. What was her name? Daniel froze. The room noticed immediately. Evelyn frowned. Her? Weiss kept staring at Daniel with widening eyes. The person who worked on this with you. Daniel's throat tightened. For several seconds he said nothing. Then quietly, Claire. The old professor sat back down heavily like the answer hit him in the chest. Around the room, confusion spread. But Evelyn noticed something else. Daniel's hands were shaking, not from fear, from memory. "She was your wife?" Evelyn asked carefully. Daniel nodded once. A silence settled over the room again, softer this time, not mocking anymore. "Human." Daniel looked toward the board. "We worked on the theorem years ago," he admitted. "Before Lily was born." "You were mathematicians?" someone asked. Daniel gave a faint, humorless smile. "We were graduate students." His eyes lowered. "A long time ago." "What happened?" another voice asked. Daniel hesitated. Then came the answer nobody expected. "Life." The single word landed harder than any speech could have. Daniel explained slowly, without drama. Claire became sick during her doctoral program. Medical debt buried them fast. Daniel dropped out first to work multiple jobs while she continued researching from home. They promised each other they'd come back to mathematics one day, but they never did. Claire died 3 years earlier. Cancer. After that, survival became more important than dreams. Daniel took the janitor job at Blackstone because it paid enough to keep raising their daughter. That was it. No tragic speech, no self-pity, just reality. By the time he finished talking, the atmosphere in the auditorium had completely changed. People no longer looked at him with amusement. Now they looked ashamed. Evelyn crossed her arms again, but this time it seemed defensive rather than arrogant. "If you understood mathematics at this level," she asked quietly, "why stay hidden?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because nobody listens to people like me." That sentence cut through the room with brutal honesty. And for the first time all night, Evelyn Cross had absolutely nothing clever to say back. The symposium ended in complete chaos. Clusters of professors surrounded the chalkboard, arguing over Daniel's proof, while reporters rushed into the auditorium after hearing rumors that an unknown janitor had just exposed a flaw in one of mathematics' biggest unsolved problems. But Daniel didn't stay. The second the crowd became overwhelming, he quietly grabbed his mop bucket and disappeared through the side hallway. By the time anyone thought to stop him, he was gone. 40 minutes later, Daniel sat at the small kitchen table inside his apartment, helping his 10-year-old daughter with fractions, like nothing unusual had happened. Their apartment was old but clean. The wallpaper peeled near the ceiling. A tiny fan rattled in the corner. Bill sat stacked beside the microwave. Lily looked up from her homework. "You're late." "Sorry," Daniel said softly. "You forgot the milk, too." Daniel blinked. "Right." She narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "Bad day?" Daniel almost laughed at how impossible that question felt. "You could say that." Lily studied him for a moment. "Somebody made you angry again?" "No, that means yes." Daniel smiled faintly despite himself. Lily Mercer had Claire's eyes and Daniel's stubbornness. She was too smart for her age and noticed things adults usually missed. She pushed her workbook aside. "What happened?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. He usually protected Lily from the harder parts of life, but tonight he looked exhausted in a way she immediately recognized. "I embarrassed someone at work." Lily grinned instantly. "Good." Daniel shook his head. "You're supposed to ask if they deserved it first." They probably did. Before Daniel could answer, his phone suddenly started vibrating nonstop across the table. Unknown numbers, emails, messages, again and again. Lily stared. Dad?" Daniel frowned and picked up the phone. His expression slowly changed as he read the notifications. Blackstone University, news requests, interview offers, mathematics departments from other universities, one message after another. Then came the final notification. Professor Evelyn Cross. Daniel stared at the name without opening the message. Lily's eyes widened. "Wait, what did you do?" He rubbed his forehead tiredly. "I corrected a theorem." She blinked twice. "What kind of theorem?" "The math kind." "Dad," Daniel sighed. "A big one." Lily folded her arms slowly. "You're doing the thing again." "What thing?" "Pretending you're normal." That hit him harder than expected. Because Lily had always known, even when he worked night shifts, even when neighbors called him the janitor, even when life crushed every dream he and Claire once had, Lily never saw him as small. To her, Daniel Mercer had always been the smartest person in the world. His phone vibrated again. This time it was a video clip. Someone had uploaded footage from the symposium. The title already had over 200,000 views. "You can't count, Professor," humiliates janitor, then regrets it. Lily's eyes went wide. Oh no. Daniel closed his eyes. Tomorrow was going to change everything. Blackstone University didn't sleep that night. By sunrise, the video had crossed millions of views. Clips were everywhere. News channels, academic forums, social media threads arguing like firestorms. Some called it a fraud. Some called it a miracle. Some called it a humiliation of academia itself. But everyone agreed on one thing. The janitor wasn't just a janitor. Daniel woke up early out of habit, even though he barely slept. The apartment felt unusually quiet. Lily was still asleep in the next room, hugging a worn-out pillow. He stood by the window for a long time, watching the street below. Cars passed like nothing had changed in the world, but his phone told a different story. 17 missed calls, 43 emails, unknown numbers continuing to pour in. Then a knock, hard, not polite. Daniel froze. Another knock followed immediately, louder this time. He walked to the door slowly. When he opened it, 2 university security staff stood outside. Behind them was a man in a formal suit holding a folder. "Mr. Mercer?" the suited man asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. "Yes." The man smiled professionally. "I'm Dr. Raymond Hale, Dean of Mathematical Sciences at Blackstone University." Daniel's grip tightened slightly on the door. "We'd like you to come with us." "For what?" Daniel asked. Hale glanced down at his folder, though he already knew the answer. "Because the theorem you touched last night has caused significant academic disruption." Daniel almost laughed. "Disruption?" Hale nodded carefully. "Several professors are reviewing their own published work. There are concerns. Concerns about what?" "Accuracy," Hale admitted. Silence stretched between them. Daniel finally spoke again, quieter now. "I have work at 7. One of the security staff looked confused. Hale raised a hand slightly. "Mr. Mercer, this is no longer about janitorial duties." Daniel's eyes sharpened a little. "That's all it's ever been about for people like me." That line made Hale pause. Before he could respond, Lily appeared behind Daniel, rubbing her eyes. She looked at the strangers at the door, then at her father. "What's going on?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, his phone rang again. This time, he answered. A familiar voice came through. Cold, controlled, still slightly shaken. "Professor Evelyn Cross." "I need to see you," she said. Daniel said nothing. Evelyn continued. "Now," there was a long pause. Then Daniel looked at Lily. Something in his expression shifted, like he was standing at a point where life splits in 2 directions. "I'll be back," he told her quietly. Lily grabbed his sleeve. "Dad." He looked down. She didn't ask him to stay. She just said, "Don't let them talk over you again." Daniel's throat tightened. Then he stepped outside, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible anymore. He felt exposed. Blackstone University's administrative building felt colder than Daniel remembered. Not physically, but in the way everyone looked at him. As he walked through the hallway beside Dr. Hale, conversation stopped mid-sentence. A few professors followed him with their eyes, like they were trying to place a missing piece of history. The janitor had become a problem no one knew how to categorize. Not staff, not student, not guest. Something else entirely. They led him into a private conference room. The walls were lined with awards, framed papers, and photographs of past symposiums. A long glass table sat in the center. At one end, Professor Evelyn Cross waited. She didn't look amused anymore. She looked tired. Not physically, mentally, like she hadn't slept. Daniel stopped near the door but didn't sit. Evelyn gestured to the chair opposite her. "Please." He remained standing. A pause. Then she sighed. Your proof is being verified by 3 independent departments. Daniel nodded once. It will hold. That confidence made her look up sharply. You're certain? Yes. Another silence. This one heavier. Evelyn finally leaned forward. Do you understand what you did last night? Daniel replied simply. I corrected an error. No, she said firmly. You reopened a problem we thought was settled. You exposed gaps in foundational assumptions across multiple published frameworks. Daniel shrugged slightly. That means they were wrong. That sentence hit the room like a stone. Dr. Hale cleared his throat. Mr. Mercer, he said carefully, Blackstone University would like to formally offer you a position. Daniel blinked once. Evelyn immediately added, Not janitorial. A faint silence followed. Hale continued, Research faculty, full access to departmental resources, laboratory privileges, academic sponsorship, funding for continued work on the theorem. Daniel looked at them both without expression. Then he asked, Why? Evelyn didn't hesitate this time. Because you solved something we couldn't. Daniel let out a short breath. And before last night? No one answered immediately. That silence said everything. He nodded slowly. So I was invisible until I wasn't. Evelyn's expression tightened. That's exactly what it is, Daniel interrupted. Not loudly, but firmly enough that it stopped her. The room went still. Daniel finally sat down. Not because they asked him to, but because standing suddenly felt unnecessary. He looked at the offer papers on the table, then at them. I don't want a position, he said. Hale frowned. Then what do you want? Daniel hesitated. For the first time since entering the building, his voice softened. I want my daughter to never feel like she has to stay quiet just to survive. That statement changed the room. Evelyn looked down at the table for a moment. Then she said something unexpected. Bring her here. Daniel looked up. Evelyn met his eyes. If she's anything like you, she said quietly, she shouldn't grow up thinking she's small either. And for the first time, Daniel saw something different in her. Not arrogance, not pity, respect, forming slowly, like something being rebuilt. Lily Mercer had never been inside a university like Blackstone. The buildings looked too clean, too sharp, like they were designed for people who never had to worry about bills or broken appliances or whether dinner would be enough. She walked beside her father through the long corridor, holding his hand tighter than usual. Daniel didn't say much, neither did she, but she noticed everything, the way professors turned to look at them, the way whispers stopped when they passed, the way security didn't question them anymore. It felt like walking through a place that had suddenly learned her father's name. They entered a lecture hall. It was smaller than the symposium auditorium, but still filled with faculty members, researchers, and a few students. At the front stood Professor Evelyn Cross, and for the first time, she didn't look like someone preparing to judge. She looked like someone preparing to understand. Daniel, she said, nodding toward Lily. He gave a small nod back. Evelyn turned to the room. Before anything else happens today, she said, there's something everyone needs to understand. She glanced at Daniel for a brief moment, then continued. We all saw a man in a janitor's uniform solve a problem that has challenged this institution for years. Murmurs spread through the hall. Evelyn raised her voice slightly. But what we didn't see was how easily we dismissed him before that moment. The room quieted. Lily looked up at her father. Daniel stood still, expression unreadable. Evelyn continued. We laughed. We assumed. We reduced his presence to something irrelevant. A professor near the side shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn didn't stop. That assumption cost us clarity. It almost cost us truth. She turned directly toward Lily. And if I'm being honest, it would have cost us even more if he had stayed silent. Lily blinked. Daniel noticed her grip on his hand loosen slightly. Evelyn stepped aside. Mr. Mercer has declined a formal position, she said. But he has agreed to something else. She gestured toward the board. Occasional lectures, open discussions, no titles required. A ripple went through the room. Daniel finally spoke. I'm not here to replace anyone. His voice was calm, steady. I'm here because I know what it feels like to be ignored until you become useful. Silence followed again. But it wasn't the same silence from before. It felt heavier, more thoughtful. Lily suddenly raised her hand slightly. Can I say something? The room turned to her immediately. Daniel looked surprised. Evelyn nodded. Of course. Lily stepped forward just a little. My dad fixes broken things, she said simply. Not just math. Everything. A few soft smiles appeared in the room. She continued. And he never tells people he's smart, because people don't listen until they already decided they should. That landed deeper than anything else. Even Evelyn didn't respond for a moment. Then Lily looked at the board. I think you all just decided wrong for a long time. A quiet pause followed. Then, unexpectedly, someone in the back started clapping, slowly at first. Then more joined, not loud, not dramatic, but real. And Daniel Mercer stood there, watching his daughter speak a truth the entire room had avoided for years. The applause didn't last long. It faded naturally, like the room wasn't used to honesty and didn't know how to hold it for too long. But something had already changed. People didn't look at Daniel Mercer the same way anymore. They couldn't. Later that evening, the lecture hall was nearly empty. Most of the faculty had left in quiet conversations, still arguing softly about equations and assumptions. The university was already preparing internal reviews of the theorem Daniel had corrected. But Daniel stayed behind. So did Lily. She sat on the edge of the stage, swinging her legs while watching her father stand near the chalkboard. Evelyn Cross remained too, leaning against a desk, arms crossed, but not defensive anymore. More reflective. No one spoke for a while. It didn't feel awkward, just settled. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. You know, she said, I spent my entire career believing intelligence announces itself loudly. Daniel gave a faint smile without turning around. It usually doesn't. That made her exhale slowly. I should have known better. Daniel finally looked at her. Most people should. Evelyn nodded once, accepting it. Lily hopped down from the stage and walked toward her father. Are we going home? She asked. Daniel looked at her. Home. The word felt different now. Not because the apartment had changed, but because the world outside it had. Yeah, he said gently. We are. Evelyn stepped forward slightly. Daniel, she said. He paused. She hesitated before speaking. If Claire were here, she'd be proud of you. For a moment, Daniel didn't respond. His expression tightened just slightly, like a memory pressing against something fragile. Then he nodded once. I know. A quiet beat followed. Then Lily took his hand again. Dad? Yes? She looked up at him. Does this mean you're not just the janitor anymore? Daniel crouched slightly so he was at her level. I was never just the janitor, he said calmly. That was just the job people could see. Lily studied him for a moment, then nodded like it made perfect sense. Okay, she said, as if that was the simplest truth in the world. Lily sighed. The university lights glowed across the campus. Somewhere inside those buildings, theories were being rewritten, careers were being questioned, assumptions were being rebuilt. But Daniel Mercer wasn't thinking about any of that as he walked out with his daughter. He was thinking about something smaller, something quieter. A life where his daughter didn't have to learn silence before she learned confidence. A life where being overlooked wasn't a rule, just a mistake that could be corrected. And for the first time in years, that future didn't feel impossible. It felt open. Never mistake silence for lack of intelligence, or simplicity for absence of depth. The world often overlooks the quietest people the longest. until truth finally breaks through assumptions built on pride and prejudice. This story reminds us that real worth is not decided by titles or appearance, but by patience, resilience, and the courage to speak even when no one is listening. We got this lesson from Daniel and Lily, that no matter how the world defines you, your value was never small, it was simply unseen.